Will be our moderator for all of our panels through the day. And Will, you want to introduce our very fine state representatives, Representative Pam Marsh and Senator Jeff Golden.
Thank you, David. Thank you. I have a mic here. So how's my sound? Is that carrying okay through the room? Great. Well, I'm really honored to be moderating 3 panels today. This is our first one. And before we head into it and I introduce our 2 panelists and get us rolling, I thought I'd just do a couple of minute recap to refresh us on what's happened so far, because it's been a rich presentation. We got off to a rousing start with the mayor, who introduced Ashland as the place where peace has a home. Now there's a soundbite. The place where peace has a home. And Senator Merkley emphasized the daily work that's needed to break down barriers. Irene shared her inspiring experience with John Lennon and Yoko Ono live, witnessing them performing Imagine, which is the ultimate peace song, and then her inspiration in Wales in 2015 that led to our peace flame here. David, again and again, has stressed our theme for today, which is both the personal and the systemic. Ambassador Chowdhury, I have a whole list of sound bites from you, sir. Peace, the place for peace is in everything. There's nothing separate. What a concept that is. And it's not enough, and then he listed a bunch of actions, if you remember, all of them worthy and important, but he emphasized that's not enough. We need an actual culture of peace, which is what we're experiencing today. Dr. Yang did something I found very moving. He took a substantial amount of his time to do what? To thank people. He named people and he said how they had inspired him personally. And I feel that's one of the most important parts of a culture of peace, is gratitude and acknowledging who's inspiring you. Thank you for that, sir. And then finally, Finley, wow, is there hope? The guy's 15. What were you doing when you were 15? I was playing touch football in Canada. He said that simple things are important, that peace begins with me, and what I felt was most important in what he said, that it's important to recognize opportunities to promote peace. What if we all just went home remembering that one thing? I think that's wonderful. So now we're up to date, and I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists after I give an appreciation for the people who asked questions earlier. Did you notice something about that? Number 1, the questions were great. And number 2, they all had a question. You know what I mean, right? So thank you. We'll do more of that, which is why I'm mentioning it. Thank you for your questions. You can write them down on the cards, hand them to me. I'll look at them over lunch. And also, we may have some live questions and answers again. So first of all, I'm going to introduce our 2 panelists here in a unique way. I think it's customary for a moderator to give like a bio of those who are speaking, but you can all read that on the website. There's materials where you can see their accomplishments, which are very important. But in keeping with our theme today, I'm going to invite first Pam and then Jeff to just begin with a short comment about their personal experience of being the flame. And I know they have some prepared comments, which we'll get to after that, and then we'll see if we can weave something together. So Pam, speaking personally to the theme for today, one of them, the personal and the systemic, but the personal first, how are you experiencing being the flame in your life?
So I'm going to inject probably a quality of real life into the discussion here this morning.
A little closer, I think.
Let me pull it up. Is that better? I think the reality is that being an elected official these days is a pretty hard route because we are not seeing a whole lot of peace building in the environments that we are a part of. And that certainly includes the state legislature for any of you who have been watching the news from Salem over the past year. Dr. Yang, I don't know if David sent you a clip of activity on the House floor, the Senate floor from the past session, but I'm going to be honest and say there were some pretty ugly moments. And so when I knew we were going to be talking from the point of view of elected officials and our work in Salem, I've had to do some deep thinking about how peace manifests in that environment and the work that I can do to really pursue the goals that we know that, although elusive, are more important than ever. So I think I would summarize briefly and say it's a struggle. We have to stay focused on a moment-to-moment basis on really trying to seek and identify and work together on the values that we all share and the values that should really guide all of the work that comes out of the Capitol. So it's a real life experiment, and it's difficult.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. First of all, thank you for being a great partner in Salem, and thank you for being willing to start out with a sobering note, which I share. I just finished my first session in the legislature in Salem, and I went there with a flame. I think you need a flame to enter politics these days, and you need to stay in touch with it. But I return with a lot of apprehension for our political institutions and some disappointment, and I think puzzlement about how we move forward. So I'm here in large part to learn and re-inspire. Ambassador Chaudhry had some insightful remarks about how the dynamics and rhythm of politics, at least as they're currently practiced, don't fit real well with a culture of peace. They're at odds with each other. And, it's the institution of politics is largely about winning and losing, overcoming, dominating, defeating. We did have a candidates forum that the Culture of Peace Commission sponsored one, and I found it very interesting. We tried to change the center of gravity of candidates forums from, let me tell you why I'm the best candidate and I'm better than her, and you should pick me, not her. That's sort of the theme. To what can we as a community vision for our future, and who might be well suited to lead us that way. And I found that very interesting. But by and large, it is a tough framework in which to apply a culture of peace. I have a couple observations. I hope I have a chance, or actually a couple moments from the session that I'd like to share that have within them, I think, clues about moving forward. And I think I'll stop right there.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And Pam, you used the word struggle, and I think it's probably a moment where all of us can just acknowledge the tremendously hard work that both of you do and that others do. We just have no way of knowing what's involved day to day in what these people do. So if you'll permit me, I would invite us all to just stand up and give these guys a standing ovation for their work. Right?
Even though that was a mandated standing,
it still counts. So Pam, you used the word struggle, and Jeff used the word apprehension, and we understand that it's not the friendliest, easiest environment that you work in. How do you manage personally? I mean, my friend Jeff here has described you to me as the hardest working person in the building.
Well, I think that's an exaggeration, but...
Well, he has a tremendous respect for you, and that's seeing you day to day, what you're doing there. How do you handle that struggle? Because I think any of us involved in peacemaking have to get used to dealing with struggle.
Well, I think as you think about the work, again, that goes on in Salem and the process of peacemaking, there's peacemaking in the process of doing the work. And there's also peacemaking in terms of what are the results of the efforts that we have up there. And I think when the process gets difficult, as it often is, I think it's really important to remain focused and motivated by the work and the outcomes. I mean, our goals there are to help families live in dignity, to make sure that all Oregonians have their basic needs taken care of, to make sure that they have housing, to make sure that the values that we all share are really present in people's lives. I mean, we talk a lot in Oregon about the rural-urban divide. That's a political tactic very often to divide us.
Right.
And it's always a little puzzling to me because, frankly, we have a district that has the smallest K-12 school district in the state, big agricultural areas, and yet we also have development right along the I-5 corridor. Are we urban? Are we rural? We're some of everything. And when you sort of poke through all of those artificial divisions that we see used to manipulate us, we understand that we all need the same things. We all need jobs in which we can feel some dignity and we can support our families. We all need schools for our children where they will thrive. We all need communities where we are known and where we can function. We all need good air to breathe and fresh water to drink. And so I think it's important for me when I'm in Salem to really focus on those objectives and the work, and to really measure our success by looking at the legislation and the pragmatic aspects of the work in terms of their application to the values and the lives that Oregonians need and deserve.
Jeff, you mentioned to me earlier in a conversation about this rural-urban division and how that was part of the recent trouble up there, the exodus of some senators and the trouble that all caused. You have had a career based in going across the aisle. I think for 35 years you've learned how to really do that. Speak a little bit about what it's like now working from the inside, because you're a senator. How are you doing it from there?
Well, that's the area in which I bring a lot of humility today. You're right, that has been a center of my interest. And the one thing I'd really like to underscore from this morning that's helpful to me is a brief comment from Mayor Stromberg about the world in which we're in today. And he dated it to 9/11, which clearly was a extremely upsetting and polarizing event. Without going on at great length, I think it's even bigger than that, but we find ourselves at a moment of history of great dislocation, very literally in terms of movement of peoples around the world from climate change and other factors, in the economy and the really rapid changes away from a natural resource and manufacturing economy, which means away from the ability of tens of millions of people to support their families in a good way. So there are worldwide billions of people who have felt the rug pulled out from under them just in the last, really sharply in the last 25 and 30 years, away from the economy that was built after World War II, which really offered an unprecedented amount of prosperity to almost everyone. What that means is that people are living in a fairly constant state of anxiety and insecurity about the future, which, as we know from history, gives the raw material for the revving up and manipulation of fear and anger and resentment and the blaming of the other. And we're living, I think, in an historical peak of that. And I think we have to keep that in the forefront of our minds. You know, people who I get aggravated with in Salem are living in that same world. And it's really important to remind ourselves of that. And the other reminder has to do with Irene Kai helped me remember this in the context of politics this year. Irene and David came to Salem in the middle of the session, and we have a practice at the beginning of every floor session in the Senate and the House where first there's the colors and a pledge of allegiance to the flag, and then there's a moment of inspiration delivered by someone. It's often religious from a minister, but it's broader than that. And Irene and David came to give one of those moments of inspiration about the culture of peace. And Irene stood up at the President of the Senate's invitation behind the podium, and she said, "I am the flame." And she explained a little about what she meant by that. And I came away as someone who was not, that attached to the moment of inspiration. I kind of went, okay, we do the flag and the inspiration, then we get on with our business. To really revisit that, because in the hubbub, in the frantic pace of the legislature, and with all of the forces that tend to polarize you and make you, adhere to either the red team or the blue team, what you can very easily forget is why you came there in the first place. Right. Everybody in that building had some kind of flame that pulled them into politics and, some of the cost of politics. And we forget it in the course of this really difficult, frantic atmosphere. And I think there's tremendous value for myself personally, I found, in asking myself on a daily basis, why are you here? Why are you here? And then more broadly, what are we here to do as individual human beings on the planet, whether we're in politics or not? And I don't think I could overstate the importance of remembering that, asking ourselves that on an ongoing basis, and maybe helping those, especially with whom we disagree, to that inquiry personally. So being the flame, I am the flame, how am I the flame, is a question that we need to ask a lot more.
Well, I'm reminded of the mayor's introduction of David and Irene, and do you remember the word that John used to describe them? Relentless. And thank you for just emphasizing what's required. And we were called to step up to be relentless in our efforts. And Pam, you mentioned a moment ago staying focused on the outcomes. And I'd like you to say a little more about that, because that seems a very practical way. As Jeff says, remind ourselves of the vision, why am I here? But then in a very practical sense, to stay focused on the outcomes. How do you do that in the midst of that confusing busyness you live in? And how do you encourage others to do it?
Well, in some ways, that's a practical matter. I mean, we have a structured process where we are considering, I think, 4,000 bills over the course of 5 or 6 months. And the process of deciding what needs to move forward is really looking at what our priorities are, what people need, and what can be effective in doing that. In this past year, I think we did a number of things that I'm extraordinarily proud of. We passed something called the Student Success Act, which will actually allow us to start funding preschool programs. We know that there was mention this morning of the importance of those babies. Yeah. We're going to start putting much more money into children from birth to age 5. We know that 90% of brain development happens at that point. Yeah. So if we should be putting public money anywhere, it's right there. We've also invested in K-12 schools. We figured out how to keep people on public health care and how to begin to transform public health care so that we are looking at upstream impacts before people get sick, to actually start to build communities and a state where people are healthy and well and don't need to walk into the emergency room to be taken care of. So we've looked at justice issues. So I think on a very practical basis, that's how I see peacemaking happening in Salem, is really on a daily basis, trying to put into place those programs and that funding that will actually enable families to thrive, children to grow up in a world in which they are capable of contributing to their communities and supporting their own families at some point. And at some point, we should talk about climate change, because that's really the undone piece.
Jeff, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to underscore how you and constituents help keep us focused on the outcome, how important that is, contact with legislators. I'm remembering a week during the campaign a year ago, and we knew at that time that one of the pressing issues. Actually, towards the end of the campaign, I was hearing about two things more than anything else, to the exclusion of almost anything else. One was the smoke, and what's it going to take to do something about it? And the other was the plight of people who are housing insecure, which are, is an epidemic, really nationally, I think, but in Oregon. So with regard to the second, I was talking to a number of groups about housing, homelessness and housing. And I got invited to events from landlords groups and realtors and developers cautioning me against doing anything, supporting anything that might upset the markets of rentals and that kind of thing, and how you can have, unintended consequences by intervening in the market, really cautioning very mild, what I take to be timid steps to solving the problem. And they include longtime friends of mine and reasonable people, and I was thinking about it, and at one point I was feeling sort of my passion to get in and really do something about homelessness and affordable housing quickly, sort of ebb a little bit. And then I was invited to meet with a group of tenants who are facing such severe problems keeping a decent roof over their heads, and they told their stories. And at the end of the session, a woman came up to me, an elderly woman who, from her appearance, looked like she was having a difficult time in life, and she said, "I'm about to cast my first vote in 40 years for you because of what you've said about homelessness." Wow. And she sort of grasped my hand and she said, just before she left, "Don't forget us. Don't forget us." And she refocused me on the outcome more than any way I could have done it myself.
Beautiful. Well, this is a short panel, so we just have a couple more minutes left. I have one question for you to close. It's a bit of an unusual question, maybe. This is your opportunity to ask us for help. How can we help you? We're not there doing the work they're doing. We're where we are doing whatever we're doing. So what would you like us to do? What's the best way we can help you relative to creating and sustaining, growing a culture of peace?
Well, first of all, I feel helped a lot by the people in this district right now. I think helping us is the same as helping democracy and helping the future, which is ongoing engagement. The Founding Fathers were very clear that they were trying an experiment that would not work with ongoing engagement, with commitment to a civic life that is not about, well, I'll get out and I'll work for a candidate or a particular issue, and then I'll be done for a while and get back to the things I care about. It's got to be woven into the fabric of things we care about. And I, for reasons we may not get a chance to go into, I think there's reasons to be skeptical that elected officials are going to lead the way in any meaningful way to a culture of peace. I think it's going to come from the people generally. You probably know that I had a bumper sticker on my car for years and years that said, "When the people lead, the leaders will follow." And I think that is especially true when it comes to establishing a culture of peace. We need the people, the constituents, to make it very clear to their elected officials that their expectation and their need and their demand is a culture of peace, and what accompanies and makes possible a culture of peace, a culture of justice. And to bring that lens to climate, to housing, to economics, to all the issues that care. And that message needs to be consistent and concise, and it's organizations like ACPC that can help cohere that message in a way that elected officials hear. And that has to be fairly constant to overcome the pressure and the dynamics of money in politics, that's there all the time, and lobbyists are there all the time for particular interests. So when the people lead, the leaders will follow, and that's the role for all of us.
Thank you, John.
Well, I would answer that by first just reflecting on the people who are in this room as I look across the tables, because I know so many of you. What I'm thinking is this work of pursuing peace is not a new idea for any of you. And if we could count up the number of phone calls that you've made and the steps that you've taken in peace marches and the protests that you've been involved in and the letters that you've written and the meetings that you've attended and the speeches that you've given and the homeless that you've fed, and if we could take all of that and somehow translate it into a common metric, that stream of energy would lead to the moon and back, and maybe to the moon and back a few times. So although this work is hard, it is familiar to all of you, and it is the work that we all together have to continue. And with that, and I share Jeff's comments about leaders, but I think my final comment would be to a plea that we really take on this climate work. I think it's extraordinarily interesting that the global climate strike happened on the same weekend as this event. Climate is the existential issue in front of us. And it is, by its very nature, not just a climate issue, not just an environmental issue, it is absolutely a social justice issue. And ultimately, it is a peacemaking issue. Because if we are not able to address the conflict that is going to emerge as the climate continues to disrupt and people are sent away from their homes, we will have no step forward. So this is our challenge. This is the work ahead. And I hope that we can all gather together to take that on.
Thank you, Pam.
Yes to every word of that. Is there time for a 2-minute story from the session?
Sure.
So I could gripe and tell you discouraging stories from the session, but I want to tell you one different story because I think there's a clue here for how we enhance the culture of peace, especially in the political realm. Until about 4 months ago, the Salem area was represented by a woman, a senator named Jackie Winters. And she had been in Oregon politics for a long time and had a lot of friends on both sides of the aisle. She happened to be a Republican. And one of the issues that she was aflame about was juvenile justice and trying to give our children who had strayed and made very serious mistakes another chance. She had a personal history that was very involved in that. So for almost all of her time in the legislature, she promoted ways to change our treatment of youthful offenders in a positive way, in a restorative justice direction. And over the years, she didn't have a whole lot of success. She did maybe slowly in changing people's thinking, but not legislative success particularly. Well, she worked on a piece of legislation that I won't go into in great depth, but our laws up until now have mandated us to sentence youthful offenders, and I'm talking about children who have committed very serious crimes, to long prison sentences, where they would end up in the adult correction systems and probably be lost to us forever. And she wasn't able to get much bipartisan support. And one of the reasons is we've had a system of mandatory minimum sentences that was approved by the people that included young people and very often sentenced them to prison for life. Senator Winters contracted cancer a couple of years ago and was getting weaker and weaker. And early in the session, the minority leader of the Senate, the Republican leader, came to the president of the Senate, and we were at odds on a lot of issues. And he said, I want you to change the calendar such that you bring Senator Winters' bill to reform juvenile justice and make exceptions and try to salvage these children. Bring it up earlier because we don't have a lot of time to do this. And there was a flurry and things got changed around. And we put that on the agenda, her bill. And she came on a walker with great assistance to the Senate chambers and made a long address about the need for this justice reform and the kind of change it could make in Oregon. And then there had been a lot of effort to find a 2/3 majority to pass this bill, which was necessary because we were overriding a citizen initiative. The citizens are the ones that passed mandatory minimum sentences. You need a 2/3 majority to overcome that. So there was a lot of backroom dealing, And all the Democrats pretty much were in favor of this, but we needed to find Republicans willing to depart from the center of their party, which for the most part doesn't want to ease up on criminal sentences. And finally, after her speech in the end, we got the 20th vote, and the legislation moved to the House. And the House Minority Leader went to the Speaker of the House and said, let's prioritize this. That was the last time that Senator Winters ever appeared before the legislature. And about 3 weeks after the House, or the Senate passed it, the House, by an exactly 2/3 vote, with others representing Senator Winters who could not come anymore, passing the bill. And Senator Winters was in the Salem Hospital watching the proceedings on TV, and as soon as it passed, apparently started going into decline and died a couple of days later.
Wow.
But that bill passed, and I think probably wouldn't have otherwise, because of the connection that all legislators had to relationship and the observation that her flame and her commitment to the betterment of Oregon, we had a chance to endorse that. And there's just, I would like us to be able to have that focus without the passing of a dear friend. So I hold on to that as one way to hope, even for the legislature, that we can be agents of a culture of peace.
Thank you, Jeff. So thank you both. Thank you. We're going to get 4 more panelists up here. Let's all stand up and stretch for a few minutes here. Thank you both.